On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, Washington bans U.S. companies from buying Huawei equipment. How has Huawei overcome this hurdle? And can populist threats to the global trading system bring China and Japan closer together?
Their role, in the whole Asia-Pacific region as well as in the trilateral relationship among U.S., Japan, and China, are increasing.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We begin with the Chinese telecom giant Huawei. On Wednesday, U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order that bars American firms from buying equipment from companies deemed as so-called national security threat. Separately, the U.S. Commerce Department said it would add Huawei to a so-called entity, meaning a blacklist, restricting its purchase from American suppliers. In response, the Chinese Commerce Ministry said Thursday that the United States should avoid increasing China-U.S. trade tensions. Amid overseas pressure, Huawei released its first AI-native database in Beijing on Wednesday. Before we get to our discussion about the reality and future for Huawei and U.S.-China trade situation, take a look at this.
No trace of anxiety at a Huawei launch product ceremony in Beijing on Wednesday. Across the Pacific, the company had received its latest blow from the U.S. government. According to Reuters, Huawei and its affiliates will be placed on a so-called entity list, making it difficult or impossible for American companies to sell components to the Chinese telecom giants. In a statement, the Shenzhen-based company said that restricting Huawei will not make the U.S. safer and stronger, but instead will only make the American 5G development lag behind, as the country will be forced to buy non-Huawei equipment that are expensive and poorly made. Chinese telecom companies are no stranger to legal battles with the American government.
By shutting them down, we're hurting a lot of American companies, really good American companies.
The founder of Huawei, Ren Zhengfei, gave interviews full of confidence. He said that eventually the U.S. and European countries will open their doors to Huawei because Huawei makes things that these countries simply must have. Just who will get the last laugh, if there's anyone laughing at all? The test has begun.
So who will get the last laugh? I guess that's an evolving process. So what's next for Huawei and the U.S.-China trade situation? Let's loop in our panelists. With us in Beijing studio, Annie Mok, who is a non-resident fellow of the Center for China and Globalization. In Shanghai, we are joined by Shen Yi, a researcher of the Center for Communication and State Governance Research in Fudan University. In Washington, D.C., the U.S., Ernest McDuffie, good to see you, the founder of the Global McDuffie Group. And in Boston, Roger Antner, the founder and lead analyst of Recon Analytics. I want to welcome the four of you gentlemen joining us on this very important topic. First of all, may I ask you, Mr. Antner, what exactly are some of the answers to quite a number of questions people raised about both the executive order and then the so-called entity list given by the Commerce Department? For example, what about now until 150 days later? What is going to be happening to the hardware already provided by Huawei to the American systems, whether it's in urban or rural areas? There are a lot of questions over there. Why there are so many questions when you have an executive order being issued and also the Commerce Department trying at least to set some regulations and rules? Why so many loopholes?
The executive order is very broad. It doesn't single out any country and any company, but the direction is quite clear that it's directed at China and companies. The most high profile here is Huawei, even though Huawei has relatively little exposure in the United States. It only does business with some small rural telcos, and we don't know if how this will proceed. And most likely, Huawei will no longer be able to provide it to these small rural companies, and they eventually potentially have to rip it out. So the loopholes and the flexibility gives them a lot of leverage to use that in other negotiations.
I see. Go to you, Mr. McDuffie. Whether it's loopholes or the the place and space that can be used to maneuver for the administration. One thing is very important, whether this is about a thing limiting Huawei or this is a strategic move against Chinese tech companies as a whole, or this is a tool for the current China-U.S. trade negotiations, I mean tool, of course, for the Trump administration.
So probably all of the above. I have no real insight into what the Trump administration's thoughts are about all this, but what's being ignored is that there's a larger problem, bigger than Huawei and China and U.S., that deals with the global supply chain. There's security issues around all types of technology that are produced globally and used in different countries around the globe, of understanding who's putting what parts and what components into each piece of hardware, and how do you guarantee that there are no backdoors and everything is secure. That's a global problem for the entire community.
Yeah. Mr. Shen, of course, there are two things that we can understand from both the executive order and also the Commerce Department announcement. Two things coming on two directions. One is that American companies are not allowed to buy anymore, according to executive order, companies that are so-called supported by the adversary governments. Of course, it's not being explained who the adversaries are, but let's say if Huawei were one of those on the list, this is one direction. The other direction is Huawei is being prevented, according to the Commerce Department entity list, to buy components coming from so-called American supplier from now on, knowing that 33%, or rather 33 out of the 90 suppliers of Huawei are American companies. So, Mr. Shen, how should we understand this both directions? If implemented, not just a negotiation tool, what would that mean for Huawei from your perspective?
It's a double-sided sword for Huawei, of course, to raise obstacles and threat the security of the supply chain of Huawei companies. But we all know that Huawei already declared that it has systems to ensure its own supply chain securities. That we will finally see the final result if it's really deployed in certain times. But on the other side, we need to understand that it's a double-sided sword. If those companies selling high technological components to Huawei cannot sell this component to Huawei, who need this? Who has enough technical capacities to buy these components and transfer them into effective efficiency 5G telecommunication productions, which can bring them back the benefits, which is the key obstacles or key goals for the commercial or the business activities. We need to think these questions in two sides. And if all these two sides, the executive orders and the list have effect, not only Huawei but its American suppliers will get damaged simultaneously.
We already know that in the stock market over the past 24 hours, there are companies that are suffering, American companies, Qualcomm, for example, Lumentum, for example, and there are likely to be more. Meanwhile, there are other companies that would be, quote-unquote, substitute suppliers for Huawei, such as those coming from European countries or from parts of Asia, are actually having their stocks rising. If you look at the market, it's already telling some stories. So, Mr. Ma, here in Beijing, how do you see the current drama? This is one thing. And secondly, how do you correlate to your colleague earlier, Mr. McDuffie said, this is going to be a disturbance to the global supply chain, and whether this is going to set a very bad precedence for all the other companies or governments who want to do whatever with the global supply chain.
Well, I think drama is a great word, Tianwei. I mean, really.
I try to select a neutral word as much as possible.
Yeah. I mean, it really is creating a lot of drama, a lot of distress, and opportunities you mentioned. I think the biggest risk to the global supply chain here is that everyone recognizes that Huawei is not only the technology leader, but also the cost leader. So by excluding Huawei from the U.S. market, I think the U.S. risks falling behind, not just risk, but it will fall behind in 5G. American companies, as you mentioned, are being hurt because if they're blocked from selling to Huawei, which has had an amazing year last year, over $100 billion in revenue. Their first quarter 2019 revenues were up almost 40%. So it's a growth company, and for American companies to miss out on that, I think would be a shame, and that would be not a drama, but a tragedy.
In a media statement Huawei put out, it said restricting it from doing business in the United States will not make the country, meaning the U.S., more secure or stronger, but it will eventually harm the interests of U.S. companies and consumers. That, of course, has been said by many of our panelists also over the past few minutes as well. But now, here is the thing, Mr. Antoner. So we all know this might not be, besides the geopolitical goals, a smart choice made by the current administration in the U.S. Whether relevant companies, interest groups, as well as governments will be able to communicate with the current administration and be able to modify what is going on right now in the executive order and also in the Commerce Department, not to mention the other departments of the United States. Current administration might also be following the executive order because it's so-called across the board.
So I think, first of all, I think the United States will not fall behind in the 5G race. There are, as mentioned, there are other vendors that are active here in the United States, like Nokia, Samsung, and Ericsson. But American consumers are certainly losing out on devices like the flagship Huawei devices that are world leading. We will see how this will actually get implemented. We have to remember that ZTE was on the same entities list and ultimately got pulled off the list as well. So I think we're here at the very early stages of that drama that you have alluded to, and I think you know, a meal is eaten not as hot as it's being cooked. So right now we have to look at this in a multifaceted approach, that there are, on one hand, persistent security concerns for more than 10 years, regardless of administration. And there's the ongoing trade negotiation with China, with the current administration. And this certainly ratchets up the pressure and the stakes. And it makes it much harder to negotiate, because if there are economic disagreements, there can be compromise. It's much harder to find compromise on national security grounds.
Okay. Well, whether it is a slowly cooked, steamed, or stir-fried, Mr. Antoner, we'll have to see. But that is a great analogy, I would assume, Mr. Mark, that to what extent China should react. And if that is a precedent being set by the American company, barring a Chinese company, this time Huawei, even bigger than ZTE, going into the American market and also buy supplies from the American suppliers, would that also mean to the American companies that are doing business here in China, selling to the Chinese consumer market and also getting supplies from the Chinese suppliers. So reciprocal has been the word used by this administration a lot. So what does that mean? Is there a potential something like this, Mr. Ma?
Well, I think it's certainly possible, but I think one thing we need to recognize is that China has unequivocally come out for greater openness and integration with the rest of the world.
But in a trade dispute, that is not necessarily going to be the case. It
Sure.
might be open to the rest of the world, but not the United States if
Yes.
one party continues to do that, right?
No, I think
there's
that
a potential of that possibility.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think what I wanted to go on to say with that, but within this broader direction of greater openness, I think China, of course, has to defend its national interest and also the interest of its companies as well,
Right.
Which, of course, there's an overlap, but there's also a difference. But I think it would be very disappointing for the U.S. to abandon its principles of open markets, because I think that would be a signal that perhaps it's lost confidence in its ability to compete. And of course that may happen, but I think it would be very unfortunate for the United States and the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China.
Mr. Shen, on the bigger picture, may I ask you, the U.S. has been pushing the other capitals around the world, particular allies in Europe, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and you name it, to ban Huawei before it bans Huawei itself. Now, the U.S. apparently is trying to ban Huawei, if you believe what the interpretations are. So, will the U.S. turn around and say to its allies, okay, I did it, see? So why didn't you guys do it? But the question really is, will others follow suit? Just follow the example of the United States, or they should take care of their own interests as well. So, Mr. Shen, help us to understand this.
I think that the state actors is rational. The rational means they consider their interest first. If the United States want to persuade its allies, it needs to providing the logic, providing the evidence. But frankly speaking, till now, the United States did not have enough evidence which is confidence enough to persuade all the allies to take actions. And the second, Huawei providing 5G. 5G is next generation communication tools which bring benefits to thousands of people all around the world. If those countries want to sacrifice their own benefit during these revolutions, frankly speaking, if you join together all these markets from the United States and together with allies, it's not representing the majority of the whole market in the world. The other rest of the world can enjoy the benefit provided by the 5G produced by Huawei, and the U.S. and its allies, or of those allies who want to sacrifice their own interests, can enjoy those relatively low qualified 5G technologies. And then in the future, the development of economies and the competitions among different actors will teach them our tough lessons. To be stupid, I think their allies are smart enough to do the good things.
I see. Mr. McDuffie, since the years I talked to you, you are always cool-minded, but at the same time very sharp. So may I ask you for the final question of today? The practice done by the current administration right now regarding so-called the companies of foreign adversary countries, what will the impact of this if others also use the same way as a weapon against American companies around the world? And meanwhile, will this set a big precedent negative to the global supply chain and the globalized economy?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that statement. I think everyone's kind of missing the point. There's a real opportunity for leadership at the international level here to address the global supply chain security issue, because it's so much broader than just Huawei or 5G. It really goes to probably 80–90% of the economy globally. Everyone's dependent on that. So I'm reminded of an expression that Ronald Reagan, I think, coined about back in the 80s: trust but verify. I mean, we have to have trusted relationships internationally, but at the same time, to address the national security aspects, we need to be able to verify things that are being presented on both sides. So it doesn't do any good for the United States to isolate itself. It doesn't do any good for any particular country to isolate itself from that global marketplace that's flourishing and will continue necessary for the advancement of all people. So we have to find a way to really deal with this issue of the security of that global supply chain.
I see. We are running out of time for this round of discussion, but certainly a lot to expect for the next few days and probably weeks as well, if not months. Thank you so much, the four of you, providing so much insight and also wisdom of your analysis. Thank you, Ernest McDuffie, Roger Antner, Andy Mark. Really appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Can populist threats to the global trading system bring China and Japan closer together? We're going to ask that question to both a Chinese and a Japanese analyst right after this. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. New life, apparently, has been breathed into the China-Japan relationship, with both sides more willing to work on bilateral cooperation. Yang Jiechi, director of the Office of Foreign Affairs Commission of the CPC Central Committee, is now visiting Japan at the invitation of Japanese National Security Advisor Shotaro Yachi. The two officials will also hold the 6th China-Japan high-level political dialogue. With trade pressure from the U.S., China and Japan have the opportunity, some say, to take charge of the global trading system. Earlier, I sat down with Takahara Akio, professor from the University of Tokyo, and Yang Bojiang, a director at the Institute of Japanese Studies of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. They discussed the China-Japan dynamic at this moment. To what extent China-Japan relations is actually to be impacted by a third party, which is the United States? Mr. Takahara, you want to go first?
There are many factors that decide Japan-China relations. One is the international environment, and certainly the American factor is the largest amongst those. And now it's actually working in a positive way as far as Japan-China relations is concerned.
Interesting. Explain, please.
Because whenever China, for example, has trouble with the United States, the traditional diplomatic pattern is to look to Japan, is to extend a friendly hand to Japan. So that's what's been happening ever since the Trump administration started to present a lot of difficult questions to China.
Are you cynical about that approach?
No, I don't think so. I think that's very realistic and pragmatic, and we should make use of that.
For you, Mr. Yang, is that the right pattern described by Mr. Karahata?
We have to admit that Sino-Japanese relationship has been determined to a great extent by the so-called U.S. factor, or the Sino-U.S. relationship, as well as the Japan-U.S. relationship. But on the other hand, we have to point out that nowadays the two countries, I mean China and Japan, their role, I mean, in the whole Asia-Pacific region, as well as in the trilateral relationship among U.S., Japan, and China, are increasing. So the Sino-Japan relationship is not as much as a so-called revival of the U.S. factor as before.
So what exactly, how would you describe the nature now, China-Japan, in a way?
China-Japan relationship has got back to the so-called normal track by the end of last year. And but the fact is, some both in China and overseas point out that this is against the background of the China-U.S. trade friction. It's not correct, because the basic fact is the Sino-Japan relationship is a restoration process started far before Trump's inauguration. It's back to the year 2014. So we can say the U.S. factor.
2014.
So we spent 3 years to get the relations back to the normal track. And during the process of the restoration of Sino-Japan relationship, President Trump came into power. Then the trade friction between China and the U.S. happened. So such a basic study can tell us that the U.S. factor does play a role in the restoration of the bilateral relation between Beijing and Tokyo, but it's not the whole.
Mr. Takahara?
Sure, that's very correct. I identify 4 areas of factors that impact on Japan-China relations. One is the international environment. The second area is domestic politics. And the third area is economics. In 2014, the slowing down of the Chinese economic growth rate became more prominent than before. And that's the situation even today. So there's an incentive for China to develop economic relationship with Japan even further. And the fourth area is people's perceptions, emotions towards the other side, especially in recent years. Chinese people's image of Japan is improving so rapidly, and that's also a factor that promotes Japan-China relations.
But the question really is, no matter what the reasons are, is Japan ready to embrace China once again with the kind of world and the region that China has in mind, in a way?
It depends on what China has in mind.
Yeah, from your understanding, what does China have in mind? And why is Japan now quite proactive in interacting with China now?
Well, whatever image the Chinese have, the Japanese people understands the importance of Japan-China relations. So if you do a public survey, 70% of the Japanese, even in the days when the relationship was very tense, 70% of the Japanese answered that Japan-China relations is important.
But the question really is, to what extent would you like to go in order to make sure it is a good relationship?
Well, of course, if possible, we can develop, but we can see some obstacles to the development of the relations, especially in the area of security and over the islands. But there is always 2 aspects in Japan-China relations. One is the resilient aspect, and the other is the fragile aspect.
So both of you represent the resilient aspect, I would assume.
Absolutely. So people like us, not only us, but everyone has to try and promote the resilient side of things and try to manage and contain the fragile aspect of things. That's what we all should aim for.
And some people even argue, Mr. Yang, this is a critical opportunity right now. The allies of the United States do not necessarily agree with some of the practices or policies these days of the current administration. So China actually could take this opportunity in explaining to the others better and have a bigger year coming from the others as to what China wants to achieve and what should be China's constructive role. But the question to you, Mr. Yang, is you've been dealing with Japan for decades. Does China understand this? How much or how long a distance would China go in order to make its voice well understood and play what also others consider as a constructive role?
I don't think China's voice or China's stand have been well understood overseas, to be honest, as well as in Japanese society. I don't think so. So we do need to promote our approach to explain our policies as well as strategies, especially in regard to the Sino-Japanese relations. Time has changed, I just mentioned that the Sino-Japanese relations have got back to normal track, but it's not the repeat of history.
Explain, please, sir.
Yeah, because the world has changed a lot in comparison with, for example, 40 years ago or even 20 years ago. And a lot of things we should, against such a new circumstances, to do between China and Japan. One is to enhance the conversations between the 2 societies, not only the 2 governments. Since the both China and Japan, their societies have changed a lot, dramatically, especially since the end of the Cold War. Even Chinese society, we are feeling the change almost every day.
Yes.
So the influence of the common people's ideas on foreign policy, on Japan's policy toward China, or on China's policy toward Japan, is now playing a much bigger role than before. The second point is how to promote our, how to say, cooperation style. May I say, from a vertical style to a horizontal style.
Explain. You have to explain about that.
Yes. For example, last year, October, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe visited China. During his meeting with President Xi Jinping, they reached an agreement that the two countries will to jointly support the third party's development. Yeah, I think this is a significant improvement in Sino-Japanese cooperation history. The third point is to build mutual trust. For example, the Diaoyu Island disputes. Yeah, of course, the precondition for this issue to be resolved is to admit to the disputes itself. You know, the Japanese official stand so far is not to admit such sovereignty disputes. If you don't even admit such disputes exist, the disputes will never be resolved, right? So a lot of things for us to consider about to do jointly from now on.
Japan will host the G20 summit in Osaka this June. Discussions of free trade and WTO reform will certainly top the agenda. So how do these two observers view multilateral mechanisms, and what will be the role of China and Japan in this regard? How can China and Japan enhance cooperation to maintain stability as well as economic prosperity in the region? Let's listen in to uncover their answers. Well, those are certainly important areas to work on, but there are immediate areas that probably China and Japan could work on. The upcoming G20 summit, as well as the WTO trade negotiation and debates. So do you see much common ground when it comes to these two countries' immediate cooperation in these areas and on these occasions? Mr. Takahara.
Sure. We should all agree upon very important principles of international economics, that is free trade, for example, rule of law, for example. These, if Japan and China jointly can argue very forcefully, that is, we are going to produce a force.
But you know, Mr. Takahara, now Japan and U.S. trade negotiation is to take place. Interestingly, right on the footstep of China-U.S. Negotiation pause. So the question really is, knowing the tactics of Mr. Trump and his team's negotiation skills, rather, will Japan be the one that will be persuaded to the camp of the so-called unilateralism and bilateralism only?
No way, because as you know, Japan
I have your word.
Because it's a trading nation.
Country.
You know, we need free trade. We need multilateralism. That's an objective condition in which we live.
Yeah. And Mr. Yang, what about from your side? To what extent is China willing to work, of course, as a scholar, with the Japanese side at the G20 summit, which I understand is likely to be a huge debate going on then, and also particularly about the future order of the trade in the world?
I think both China and Japan have a very strong desire to cooperate or to work together in regard with the WTO reform issue. There is a big potential for the two sides to talk about, to work together in regard with that issue. But the precondition is we have to calmly judge what the Japanese stand is. And because on one hand, we do a lot of things in common with Japan. For example, as Professor Takahara mentioned, we both benefited from the free trade mechanism so far, and we both played a very big role in maintaining such a freedom system so far. So in that sense, may I say, we have something in common. Yeah, but on the other hand, we don't have. I don't think Japan has the same stance with China in terms like electronic business or network information. Its stance is even closer to that of the United States as well as the European countries. Yeah, not closer to, rather than closer to Chinese stance. So we have to keep our mind cool in the very first place.
There's another important issue about immediate cooperation. That is, what do the two countries have in mind about their vision of the region and beyond? How does Japan look at its potential in the region and probably beyond? How will that coordinate or in disagreement with China's vision so far? Mr. Takahara, knowing both pictures very well, I really want to have your understanding here. What can we expect?
You know, the first point is many Chinese people misunderstand that the Japanese are full of ambitions to become a political power, to become a military power. That's not the case.
I'm not sure whether when you say most of the Chinese people, have you done some survey about that? I have not done a survey, so I can't agree with you.
I've never met a Chinese person who doesn't think that way.
Really? Mr. Yang, do you think that way?
But anyway.
Okay, all right.
Anyway.
You just finished, yeah.
Yeah.
And then Mr. Yang will rebuttal.
What I want to say is, the fact is that the Japanese people love the status quo. You know,
which is?
Which is what we have now.
What is?
And as he said, a horizontal, equal partnership amongst all the nations without any military development, you know, peace as the main melody in the region. We have maintained peace very well for a very long time, even though Japan was the outstanding power, but it did not develop its military power, and people are very happy about that. The Southeast Asian nations are very happy about the Japanese behavior in the past decades. So we really hope that China, now that it's emerging, or it has already emerged as the biggest power in the region, will maintain what he said, the horizontal equal partnership with all the other nations in a very peaceful way. Do not act. Refrain from acting. Self-restraint, I think, is the key for the biggest power in the region.
So let me go to you, Mr. Yang. So China has this, what China initiated, but eventually a platform, a Belt and Road Initiative. All parties, according to China's plan, is to win and win and win. On the other hand, China is the second largest economy in the world. That's just a fact.
Yeah.
And therefore, others see China differently these days. Thirdly, China is a country that is already become powerful before it becomes rich. You think about all the other economies, they have decades of so-called free time before they play a huge responsibility, both regional and globally, after they become rich. United States, for example, only after Second World War. But China differently, already being asked to play responsible role in the region and beyond. So, Mr. Yang, now under those circumstances, as complicated as they are, how do you see China's willingness to work with Japan also and to coordinate with Japan's plan for its own approach to the region and probably beyond? Mr. Yang.
Yeah. And first of all, I think China has to make itself better understood by the rest of the world. The way for Chinese to develop and Chinese, the real Chinese face or Chinese society today, you know, I don't think the people overseas understand Chinese so well. To be honest, both are responsible for such circumstances, I think. In my view, Japan plays a very big role in Chinese, for example, so far for Chinese reform and opening up, success. And from now on, it will continue to play a big role. Several aspects may I point to. One is in economic cooperation field, and second in the regional cooperation, the picture, the whole picture, and we have to discuss with Japan. And third, about the surrounding area environment for China. In this regard, may I say, Japan has not only a constructive role, but also has a destructive role to play.
Meaning?
Meaning, if we don't enjoy a good relations with Japan, Japan will go to other side and to play a negative role in the shaping of our outside environment.
As both of you said, we're going to observe very closely. There are a lot of nuances, a lot of changes that only makes our job ever more exciting, isn't it? Hopefully, also in the good direction. Thank you so much for both of you being with us. Thank you so much, Mr.
Thank you very much.
Well, that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tianwei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.